Hey there. Tonight, we're going back to a time when an era was dying and legends were turning to dust. We'll follow the entire arc of the Vanderlinde Gang, a family of outlaws watching their dream of freedom turn to dust. It's a story of loyalty, betrayal, and what it costs to find redemption when it's almost too late. If this kind of tale helps you rest, feel free to like the video, but only if it brings you some peace. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from. It's a real comfort to know who else is out there settling in. In the year 1855, a boy named Dutch Vanderlinde was born to an enigmatic woman whose past remained shrouded in mystery. His father fought in the American Civil War, leaving young Dutch with stories of honor, sacrifice, and the brutal realities of a changing nation. But when his father was killed during the war, Dutch's worldview began to take shape. He saw a country built on the backs of the poor, where the rich exploited the weak, and where survival often meant taking what you needed from those who had too much. Dutch wasn't born an outlaw. He was born a dreamer, a philosopher who read Evelyn Miller's romantic prose about freedom and the untamed frontier. He devoured the works of intellectuals, absorbing ideas about individual liberty, the corruption of civilization, and the nobility of living outside society's constraints. These weren't just books to Dutch, they were blueprints for a different kind of life. By the time Dutch reached his 20s, he had already developed a silver tongue and a charismatic presence that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He could quote philosophers, spin tales of adventure, and paint pictures of a life free from the chains of society. But Dutch's philosophy wasn't just talk. He genuinely believed that the American dream had been corrupted, that banks and corporations had stolen the land from the people, and that taking from them wasn't theft, it was justice. Around 1870, Dutch met a man who would become his closest friend and most trusted advisor. Hosea Matthews was older, wiser, and had already lived a life full of cons, scams, and narrow escapes. Where Dutch was passionate and idealistic, Hosea was pragmatic and cunning. The two men complemented each other perfectly. Hosea saw in Dutch a leader who could inspire loyalty, while Dutch saw in Hosea a voice of reason that could keep his grand plans grounded in reality. Together, Dutch and Hosea began their partnership. At first, they ran small cons, selling fake medicine, cheating at cards, and robbing stagecoaches. But Dutch always insisted they had a code. They never killed innocent people, they never robbed from those who couldn't afford it. They were outlaws, yes, but they were outlaws with principles. In Dutch's mind, they were modern-day Robin Hoods, taking from the corrupt and giving to themselves and those they protected. As the years passed, Dutch and Hosea's operation grew. They needed more hands, more guns, and more people who shared their vision. In 1877, everything changed when they encountered a young boy, barely a teenager, caught trying to rob them. His name was Arthur Morgan. Arthur's story was one of tragedy and abandonment. His mother had died when he was young, and his father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal who dragged Arthur into a life of crime before disappearing entirely. By the time Arthur met Dutch and Hosea, he was alone, desperate, and facing a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. Dutch saw something in Arthur that night. He saw a boy who needed guidance, who needed a family, and who had the potential to become something greater than the circumstances that had shaped him. Dutch didn't just take Arthur in. He became the father Arthur never had. He taught him to read, to think, to see the world through a lens of justice rather than simple survival. Hosea taught him patience, strategy, and the art of the con. Together, they molded Arthur into a man who would become the very backbone of their growing family. Arthur wasn't just loyal to Dutch. He was devoted to him, believing with every fiber of his being that Dutch's vision of freedom and justice was worth fighting for. In the early years, the gang was small but effective. Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur pulled off robberies with precision and style, always staying one step ahead of the law. They lived off the land, moving from camp to camp, never staying in one place long enough for the authorities to catch up. And as they traveled, they gathered more souls who had been cast aside by society. In 1878, another young boy joined their ranks. John Marston was only 8 years old when Dutch found him, orphaned and left to die by his father, who had been blinded in a bar fight. His mother, a prostitute, had died in childbirth, and the boy had survived on the streets through sheer will and luck. Dutch offered him the same thing he had offered Arthur: a family, a purpose, and a chance at something better. Arthur, now in his late teens, took on the role of older brother to John, though their relationship was complex from the start. Arthur saw John as reckless and immature, someone who hadn't earned his place the way Arthur had. John, for his part, resented Arthur's position as Dutch's favorite son. But despite their differences, they were brothers in the only way that mattered. They bled together, fought together, and survived together. The gang continued to grow throughout the 1880s. They recruited men and women from all walks of life, each with their own reasons for joining. Some came for the money, some for the adventure, and some because they had nowhere else to go. But Dutch had a gift for making each person feel like they were part of something greater, a family bound not by blood, but by loyalty and shared ideals. Susan Grimshaw joined the gang as a young woman, becoming Dutch's lover for a time before transitioning into the role of camp matriarch. She was tough, no nonsense, and fiercely protective of the gang's women. She kept the camp running smoothly, managed supplies, and made sure everyone pulled their weight. Under her watchful eye, the camp became a home rather than just a temporary refuge. Bill Williamson came to the gang as a former soldier, dishonorably discharged from the military for deviancy and attempted murder. He was a man of limited intelligence but fierce loyalty, someone who craved structure and purpose. Dutch gave him both, and Bill repaid that gift with unwavering dedication. He wasn't the smartest or the most skilled, but he was dependable in a fight and would follow Dutch into hell if asked. Javier Escuela fled to America from Mexico after killing a high-ranking military official in a fight over a woman. He was a revolutionary at heart, someone who had fought for the poor and oppressed in his homeland before circumstances forced him north. When Dutch found him starving and desperate in the American wilderness, Javier saw in Dutch a kindred spirit, another man who believed in fighting against injustice. Dutch quite literally saved Javier's life, and from that moment on, Javier's loyalty to Dutch was absolute. The gang's success in the 1880s and early 1990s was built on a combination of careful planning, quick thinking, and an unshakable belief in Dutch's leadership. They robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches, always targeting institutions and wealthy individuals rather than ordinary people. Dutch insisted on this code, and for years it held. They were outlaws, but they were outlaws with honor. Hosea remained Dutch's most trusted advisor throughout these years, often serving as the voice of reason when Dutch's plans became too ambitious or risky. Where Dutch saw grand gestures and bold statements, Hosea saw the practical concerns. How many lawmen would respond, what the escape routes looked like, how much heat they could afford to attract. The partnership between Dutch's vision and Hosea's pragmatism made them one of the most successful outlaw gangs in the country. Arthur, meanwhile, had grown into Dutch's most capable and deadly enforcer. By his 30s, Arthur was a man of few words but decisive action. He was the one Dutch sent when things needed to get done, whether that meant collecting debts, scouting locations, or handling situations that required a steady hand and a quick draw. Arthur's loyalty to Dutch was absolute, and he believed deeply in the gang's code of honor. But Arthur was also developing his own moral compass. He had fallen in love with a waitress named Eliza, and together they had a son, Isaac. For a brief time, Arthur experienced what it might be like to have a life outside the gang, to be a father, and perhaps something more respectable. He would visit them when he could, bringing money and gifts, trying to be present as his life with the gang pulled him in the opposite direction. Tragedy struck when Arthur returned one day to find both Eliza and Isaac had been killed during a robbery. The loss devastated Arthur, reinforcing his belief that the outlaw life brought nothing but pain to those who got too close. He buried his grief deep, throwing himself even harder into his work for the gang and distancing himself from emotional attachments. The death of his son became a wound that never fully healed, a constant reminder of the cost of the life he had chosen. John Marston, meanwhile, was struggling to find his place. He had grown into a capable gunman, but lacked Arthur's discipline and focus. In 1894, John fell in love with a woman named Abigail Roberts, a former prostitute who had been working with the gang. When Abigail became pregnant, John panicked. He wasn't ready to be a father, wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. When their son Isaac was born in 1895, John did what he thought was easiest. He ran. For nearly a year, John abandoned the gang, leaving Abigail and Jack behind. The gang supported them in his absence, with Arthur in particular stepping up to help provide for the woman and child that John had discarded. When John finally returned in 1896, he faced the disappointment and anger of his family, particularly Arthur, who saw John's abandonment as the ultimate betrayal of the gang's values. Dutch welcomed John back, but the damage had been done. John would spend years trying to prove he had changed, trying to be a better man and a better father. As the 1890s progressed, the world around the Vanderlyn gang began to change in ways they couldn't ignore. The frontier was closing. Towns were growing into cities. Telegraph lines stretched across the country. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by banks and railroad companies, was becoming increasingly sophisticated in tracking and capturing outlaws. The wild, lawless spaces where the gang had thrived were shrinking year by year. Dutch felt the pressure of these changes, but rather than adapting, he doubled down on his philosophy. He gave impassioned speeches around the campfire about loyalty, about family, about standing against the tide of so-called civilization that sought to control and exploit the common man. He insisted that one more big score, one more perfect robbery, would give them enough money to disappear, to buy land somewhere far away where they could live free from the law and from society's corruption. Hosea grew increasingly concerned about Dutch's state of mind. He noticed his old friend becoming more volatile, more resistant to counsel, more willing to take unnecessary risks. But Hosea's influence, while still significant, was beginning to wane as Dutch surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to hear. In 1898, the gang gained an unexpected new member who would become one of their most valuable assets. Micah Bell was a career criminal from a family of outlaws, a man with no real principles beyond self-preservation and personal gain. He was manipulative, racist, cruel, and utterly devoid of the honor that Dutch claimed to value. But Micah was also clever, and he knew exactly how to appeal to Dutch's ego. Where Hosea questioned Dutch's increasingly risky plans, Micah encouraged them. Where Arthur expressed concerns about the law closing in, Micah assured Dutch that his vision was perfect and that doubters simply lacked faith. Micah positioned himself as Dutch's true believer, and Dutch, perhaps sensing his own grip on reality beginning to slip, embraced this validation eagerly. Arthur immediately distrusted Micah, seeing through his false flattery and recognizing him for what he was, a snake who would sell out the gang the moment it benefited him. But Arthur's warnings fell to deaf ears. Dutch had become too invested in Micah's support, too dependent on having someone tell him he was right. The gang's last golden years were marked by increasingly bold and dangerous robberies. They hit the bank in Northfield, barely escaping with their lives. They robbed trains belonging to Leviticus Cornwall, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America, making a powerful enemy in the process. Each successful score brought more money, but also more attention from law enforcement. In early 1899, Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur began planning what they believed would be their greatest and final score, a ferry robbery in Blackwater. The Blackwater ferry was rumored to be carrying a fortune in cash, enough money to finally allow the gang to retire and disappear. Dutch became obsessed with this job, seeing it as the culmination of everything they had worked toward. But there were warning signs that something wasn't right. The plan seemed too good to be true, the intelligence too perfect. Hosea expressed reservations about the timing and the risk, but Dutch pushed forward, convinced that this was their destiny, their one chance at the freedom they had always fought for. The Blackwater ferry robbery in May 1899 would prove to be the beginning of the end for the Vanderlyn gang. What should have been their greatest triumph became their greatest disaster, a massacre that would haunt them all and set in motion the events that would tear the family apart. The plan for the Blackwater ferry robbery was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. Dutch had received intelligence that a ferry would be transporting a substantial amount of money, allegedly $150,000, making it the biggest score the gang had ever attempted. The money was supposed to be payment for some kind of real estate deal, cash that wouldn't be heavily guarded because discretion was more important than security. Dutch divided the gang for the operation. He would lead a team, including Hosea, Arthur, and several others, to handle the ferry job directly. The rest of the gang, including the women, the elderly Strauss, Reverend Swanson, and others less suited for high-risk operations, would wait at the main camp outside Blackwater. It was supposed to be a quick job, in and out before the law even knew what was happening. But something went wrong from the beginning. The moment Dutch and his team reached the ferry, they found themselves facing far more resistance than anticipated. What should have been a simple robbery turned into a bloodbath. Shots rang out across the Blackwater docks and chaos erupted. In the confusion and violence, Dutch shot and killed an innocent young woman named Heidi McCourt. The circumstances of her death remain unclear. Was it panic? Was it an accident? Did she see something she shouldn't have? Dutch would never fully explain what happened, and those who were there would speak of it only in hushed tones. But that single death marked a turning point, a moment when Dutch crossed a line that his own code of honor should have prevented. The gang members present described it as a massacre, a complete disaster where nothing went according to plan. Mac and Davy Callender, two brothers who had been with the gang for years, were shot during the chaos. Jenny Kirk, a young woman who had joined the gang seeking adventure and freedom, was also killed. The gang managed to escape Blackwater with some money, but not the fortune they had anticipated, and certainly not enough to justify the cost. Even worse, John Marsden was shot and left behind in the confusion. The gang believed he might be dead or captured, adding to their desperation. And somewhere in the chaos, the money they did manage to steal, somewhere around $150,000 was hidden by Dutch in a place only he knew. This money would become a source of obsession and tension in the months to come. But the most devastating casualty of Blackwater wasn't someone who died, it was trust. Something fundamental had broken in the gang that day. Dutch had made a critical mistake, had killed an innocent woman, and the job that was supposed to set them free had instead painted targets on all their backs. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by Leviticus Cornwell and eager to make an example of the Vanderlyn gang, descended on Blackwater with unprecedented force. Pinkertons, led by Agent Andrew Milton and Agent Edgar Ross, were relentless, coordinating with local law enforcement to create a dragnet that forced the gang to flee north into the mountains, away from the moderate climate of West Elizabeth and into the harsh winter of the Grizzlies. As the gang fled, they picked up their main camp members and began a desperate journey through a blizzard, heading higher into the mountains where they hoped the law wouldn't follow. They were running for their lives now, no longer the hunters, but the hunted. The wounded were dying, supplies were running low, and the gang that had prided itself on being prepared for anything found itself facing the very real possibility of freezing to death in the mountains. Dutch tried to maintain morale, insisting this was just a temporary setback, that they would weather this storm like they had weathered all the others. But the gang members could sense something had changed in Dutch. He was more erratic, more defensive, more prone to angry outbursts when his decisions were questioned. The massacre at Blackwater had shaken something loose in him, and everyone could feel it. Arthur Morgan, ever loyal, tried to keep the gang together through sheer force of will. He scouted ahead, found shelter, and kept people moving when exhaustion and despair threatened to stop them. He carried the wounded, shared his food, and projected a confidence he didn't entirely feel. If Dutch was the gang's philosopher and visionary, Arthur had become its spine, the one who held everything together when the vision wasn't enough. They found temporary refuge in an abandoned mining town called Coulter, buried deep in the Grizzlies. The buildings were dilapidated, and the wind howled through gaps in the walls, but it was shelter, and shelter meant survival. The gang holed up there, tending to the wounded and hoping the blizzard would cover their tracks. Davy Callender died from his wounds within days of arriving at Coulter, adding another name to the list of casualties from Blackwater. The gang buried him in the frozen ground, a grim reminder of how much they had lost. Mac Callender, his brother, was presumed dead or captured, leaving Bill Williamson devastated as he had been close friends with the brothers. But a miracle occurred when Arthur found John Marston, alive but barely, attacked by wolves and left for dead on a mountainside. John's face was torn open, his body covered in bite marks and gashes. Arthur brought him back to camp, where the gang's doctor, while limited in supplies, managed to save his life. John would survive, but would carry the scars from that wolf attack for the rest of his days. During their time in Coulter, the gang was forced to take desperate measures to survive. They robbed a homestead, taking food and supplies from a family barely better off than themselves. They hit a train belonging to Leviticus Cornwell, the powerful oil magnate who had become their enemy. Dutch justified these actions as necessary for survival, but the gang that once prided itself on having standards was beginning to compromise those standards more and more frequently. The train robbery brought them into direct conflict with Cornwall's security forces, and Dutch's solution to being cornered was to execute several of Cornwall's men in cold blood. It was a far cry from the gang that once claimed to have a code against senseless killing. But Dutch insisted these men were no better than Pinkertons, hired guns protecting a robber baron who exploited the land and its people. As the weather finally began to clear, Dutch announced they would move east into a region called New Hanover. They couldn't stay in the mountains, and they couldn't return to the west where the Pinkertons were waiting. Their only option was to descend from the mountains, find a place to lay low, and figure out their next move. The descent from the Grizzlies was treacherous, but the gang made it down into the more hospitable valley below. They established a new camp near Valentine in a place called Horseshoe Overlook. The location was hidden, defensible, and close enough to the town of Valentine that they could access supplies while remaining relatively invisible to the law. At Horseshoe Overlook, the gang attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy. The camp was set up with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this dozens of times before. Tents were erected, a campfire was built in the center, and the gang members fell into their familiar roles. Susan Grimshaw organized the women and managed supplies. Pearson, the gang's butcher and cook, set up his station and began preparing meals. Uncle, the gang's resident drunk and self-proclaimed lumbago sufferer, found ways to avoid work while providing occasional musical entertainment. Dutch's tent was placed prominently at the camp's edge, overlooking the valley, a physical manifestation of his role as the gang's leader and visionary. Hosea's tent was nearby, reflecting his position as Dutch's right hand and advisor. Arthur's tent was modest and practical, positioned where he could keep an eye on the camp's perimeter. The gang quickly began scouting the area and planning small jobs to rebuild their funds. Valentine was a rough livestock town, the kind of place where a gang of outlaws could blend in relatively easily as long as they kept their heads down. The saloon was rowdy, the sheriff was lazy and corrupt, and the town was full of drunk cowboys and workers from local ranches. Arthur became the gang's primary operator, going into Valentine to gather information, make contacts, and identify opportunities. It was during one of these trips that Arthur first met a peculiar character who called himself Leviticus Cornwall's right-hand man. In reality, he was a con artist who had been playing both sides, feeding information to whoever would pay. But Valentine also brought the gang into contact with people who would become important to their story. Sadie Adler was found during a job early in their time at Horseshoe Overlook. Arthur, Dutch, Micah, and Bill had been sent to rob a homestead, expecting to find easy pickings. Instead, they found Sadie hiding in the basement, traumatized and enraged after the O'Driscoll gang had murdered her husband, Jake, and burned her home. The O'Driscolls were led by Colm O'Driscoll, a former partner of Dutch's from decades earlier. The two men had once worked together before a falling out led to years of bitter rivalry and violence. Colm's brother had been killed during one of their conflicts, and Colm had retaliated by killing Dutch's first love, Annabelle. The hatred between the two gangs ran deep, making any encounter between them likely to end in bloodshed. Sadie was brought back to camp, and despite her trauma, she refused to be treated as helpless. She was angry, grieving, and burning with a desire for revenge against the men who had destroyed her life. Susan Grimshaw initially tried to assign her traditional women's work around camp, but Sadie chafed against these restrictions. She wanted to fight, to ride, to make the O'Driscolls pay for what they had done. Arthur saw something of himself in Sadie's rage and grief. He understood loss, understood the desire to make someone hurt the way you were hurting. Over time, he would become one of her strongest advocates in the gang, recognizing that her anger could be channeled into something useful if given the chance. The gang's main focus at Horseshoe Overlook was raising money and figuring out their next move. Dutch insisted they needed one more big score, enough money to disappear for good. The Blackwater money was out of reach for now, hidden somewhere back west where the Pinkerton presence was too strong to risk retrieving it. So they needed to find another opportunity, another job that could fund their escape. Hosea, ever the pragmatist, suggested they focus on smaller, safer jobs, rob some coaches, rustle some cattle, maybe hit a small-town bank, build up their funds gradually while keeping a low profile. But Dutch was impatient. He felt the pressure of the Pinkertons closing in, the pressure of the gang looking to him for answers, and the pressure of his own vision slipping further from reach. It was during this time that the gang became aware of Leviticus Cornwall's operations in the area. Cornwall owned mines, oil fields, factories, and railroads. He was the embodiment of everything Dutch claimed to hate. A robber baron who built his fortune on the backs of exploited workers, who bought politicians and lawmen, who treated the land and its people as resources to be extracted and discarded. Dutch became fixated on Cornwall as a target. Robbing Cornwall wasn't just about money anymore. It was about making a statement, about striking back against the kind of man who represented everything wrong with civilized society. Hosea warned that drawing Cornwall's attention was dangerous, that a man with that much power and money could bring more heat down on them than they could handle. But Dutch was convinced that hitting Cornwall was both profitable and righteous. The gang also dealt with more immediate threats. The O'Driscolls were active in the area, and tensions between the two gangs led to several violent confrontations. Arthur and the boys would regularly clash with O'Driscoll members, each side leaving bodies in their wake. Colm O'Driscoll himself remained elusive, always sending his men to do his dirty work while he plotted from the shadows. During one of these conflicts, Arthur was lured into a trap. The O'Driscolls sent word of a possible parley between Dutch and Colm, suggesting they might be able to end their feud. Dutch was skeptical, but agreed to meet, bringing Arthur along as protection. But it was all a setup. While Dutch met with Colm, Arthur was ambushed, beaten, and taken prisoner. The O'Driscolls held Arthur for days, torturing him for information about the gang and their plans. Colm's real goal was to use Arthur as bait, to lure Dutch into a rescue attempt where Colm could capture or kill him. But Dutch never came. Whether he believed Arthur was already dead, whether he was too focused on other concerns, or whether some part of him had already begun to change, Dutch left Arthur to his fate. Arthur managed to escape on his own, killing his captors and making his way back to camp, wounded and furious. This was the first major crack in Arthur's loyalty to Dutch. He had been captured trying to help Dutch make peace with his oldest enemy, and Dutch hadn't even looked for him. When Arthur confronted him about it, Dutch offered excuses and deflections, claiming he had been planning a rescue, that Arthur had simply escaped before he could execute it. Arthur wanted to believe him. He needed to believe him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would only grow larger in the months to come. The gang's time at Horseshoe Overlook also brought them into contact with more of the region's colorful characters. They did work for the local sheriff, stealing back a wagon that had been taken by a rival gang, all while the lawman pretended not to know they were wanted criminals. They helped a German family fight off outlaws attacking their property, earning some goodwill even as they continued their own criminal activities. Reverend Swanson, the gang's deeply troubled priest, struggled with his morphine addiction throughout this period. Once a man of genuine faith who had wanted to help people, Swanson had fallen into drug abuse and self-loathing. He would disappear on benders, sometimes for days, returning dirty and desperate, begging for forgiveness that Arthur and others grew tired of granting. Strauss, the gang's loan shark, continued his morally questionable practice of lending money to desperate people at exorbitant interest rates, then sending Arthur to collect when they inevitably couldn't pay. Arthur hated this work, seeing it as little better than robbery, but he did it because Dutch insisted the gang needed every dollar it could get. One of these collections introduced Arthur to Thomas Downs, a kind man dying of tuberculosis who had borrowed money to try to save his family's farm. When Arthur came to collect, Downs had nothing to give. In the ensuing confrontation, Arthur beat the sick man, who coughed blood directly into Arthur's face. It was a moment that would have devastating consequences, though Arthur didn't know it yet. Mary Linton, Arthur's former love, also re-entered his life during this period. They had been engaged once, years ago, but Mary's family had disapproved of Arthur's outlaw lifestyle and forced them apart. Despite everything, they had never fully let go of each other. Mary reached out to Arthur for help with her family problems. Her father was drowning in debt. Her younger brother was mixed up with a strange religious cult. Arthur helped her, riding out to confront the cult leader and dragging Mary's brother away from the con artists who had taken advantage of him. It was a glimpse of the man Arthur might have been in a different life, someone who helped people because it was right, not because it served the gang's interests. Mary asked him to run away with her, to leave the outlaw life behind and start afresh. But Arthur couldn't abandon Dutch, couldn't abandon the gang that was his only family. Mary left heartbroken, and Arthur returned to camp carrying the weight of what he had given up.
The gang also began to notice changes in Dutch's behavior that went beyond mere stress. He was more volatile, quicker to anger, more paranoid about who he could trust. He gave rambling speeches about loyalty and doubt, about having faith and following the plan. When gang members questioned his decisions, even respectfully, Dutch would respond with barely contained rage or cold dismissiveness. Micah Bell's influence continued to grow during this time. He positioned himself as Dutch's most loyal soldier, always ready with encouragement and agreement. Where Hosea counseled caution and Arthur expressed practical concerns, Micah told Dutch what he wanted to hear, that he was a genius, that the doubters were weak, that one more bold move would solve all their problems. Dutch began sending Micah on more jobs, relying on his counsel more than Hosea's, and brushing aside Arthur's reservations about the violent, unpredictable outlaw. The old guard of the gang, Arthur, Hosea, and John, saw what was happening but felt powerless to stop it. Dutch had been their leader for so long, had saved each of them in their own way, that challenging him felt like betrayal. As spring turned to summer, the gang's situation became increasingly precarious. The Pinkertons were getting closer, asking questions in Valentine, putting pressure on local lawmen to cooperate in hunting down the Vanderlinde gang. Dutch made the decision to move camp again, this time to a location called Clemens Point, near the town of Rhodes. Rhodes was a southern town still deeply scarred by the Civil War, split between two feuding families, the Greys and the Braithwaites. These families had been at each other's throats for generations, each blaming the other for various slights and crimes, real and imagined. The entire town was caught in the crossfire of their conflict, with locals forced to take sides in a war that should have ended decades earlier. Dutch saw an opportunity. He proposed that the gang play both sides, doing jobs for both the Greys and the Braithwaites while pitting the families against each other. The plan was to weaken both families until the gang could rob them both and disappear before either realized what had happened. It was classic Dutch, ambitious, clever, and far more complicated than it needed to be. Hosea went along with the plan, but expressed reservations. Playing two powerful families against each other was risky, and if either family discovered what the gang was doing, the consequences would be severe. But Dutch was convinced of his own cleverness, certain that his manipulation would succeed where a more straightforward approach might fail. The gang began working for both families. They helped the Greys with various tasks, including intimidating their rivals and retrieving stolen property. They also worked for the Braithwaites, helping with their moonshine operations and dealing with their enemies. All the while, Dutch fed information to both sides, carefully orchestrated to increase tensions between them. Sean Maguire, a young Irish member of the gang who had been captured after Blackwater and held by bounty hunters, was rescued during this period. His return to the gang was celebrated with a party, a rare moment of genuine joy and camaraderie. Sean was loud, brash, and recklessly optimistic, qualities that made him both entertaining and exhausting. His reunion with the gang, particularly with his close friend Lenny Summers, lifted spirits that had been weighing heavy for months. But the good times were short-lived. During a job in Rhodes, the gang walked into an ambush. The Greys had discovered Dutch's duplicity and set a trap. In the ensuing gunfight, Sean was shot in the head, killed instantly in front of the entire gang. One moment he was talking, joking, alive, and the next he was gone. The gang barely escaped with their lives, fighting their way out of Rhodes as the entire Grey family and their allies tried to kill them. Sean's death hit the gang hard, particularly Lenny, who lost his best friend. But it also exposed the fatal flaw in Dutch's plan. He had been so confident in his ability to manipulate both families that he never seriously considered what would happen when his deception was discovered. Now one family knew the truth, and the other would soon follow. The gang's relationship with the Braithwaites deteriorated shortly after. Catherine Braithwaite, the family matriarch, was far shrewder than Dutch had given her credit for. She discovered the gang's scheme and decided to strike back in the most devastating way possible. She had Jack Marston, John and Abigail's young son, kidnapped. When the gang discovered Jack was missing, panic set in. Abigail was hysterical, John was desperate, and even Dutch, for all his flaws, seemed genuinely disturbed. They had crossed many lines, but involving children had never been part of their code. The gang descended on Braithwaite Manor with fury, cutting through the family's guards and workers like a knife through butter. Inside the manor, they found Catherine Braithwaite, who revealed with bitter satisfaction that she had sold Jack to Angelo Bronte, a crime lord in Saint-Denis. Before anyone could stop him, Dutch shot her, then ordered the gang to burn the manor to the ground. The Braithwaite estate went up in flames. Decades of accumulated wealth and history reduced to ash and embers. But Jack was still missing, and the gang had made another powerful enemy in Angelo Bronte. Dutch, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, decided they needed to move closer to Saint-Denis, the largest city in the state. They established a new camp at Shady Belle, an abandoned plantation manor that had fallen into disrepair since the Civil War. Shady Belle was defensible but decrepit, infested with alligators and the remnants of various squatters who had taken up residence over the years. The gang cleared it out, establishing their camp in and around the crumbling mansion. It was a far cry from the open, natural beauty of their previous camps, but it was close to the city, and proximity to Saint-Denis was now a necessity rather than a choice.
Angelo Bronte was a powerful figure in Saint-Denis, a crime boss who had politicians, police, and judges in his pocket. He ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist, and crossing him was a death sentence for most men. But Dutch, in his desperation and arrogance, believed he could negotiate with Bronte, could charm or intimidate the Italian criminal into returning Jack peacefully. Arthur, John, and Dutch traveled to Bronte's mansion, an opulent estate in the wealthiest district of Saint-Denis. They were escorted inside, where they met Bronte, a cultured and educated man, who spoke with refinement and courtesy while making it clear he held all the cards. Bronte had taken Jack not for ransom, but as leverage, a way to control and humiliate Dutch. Bronte enjoyed watching Dutch squirm, making him beg and plead for the boy's return. He eventually agreed to give Jack back, but only after Dutch proved useful to him. Bronte sent the gang to deal with some grave robbers who had been disturbing the city's cemetery, a task meant to demonstrate their subservience to him. The gang completed the job, and Bronte, true to his word, returned Jack unharmed. But the humiliation of having to bow to a man like Bronte ate at Dutch. He had been forced to show weakness, to admit he couldn't protect his own family without the permission of a city crime boss. This experience, combined with the accumulating failures and losses, pushed Dutch further toward instability. Bronte, perhaps enjoying his power over Dutch, also gave the gang a tip about a big riverboat carrying significant money. He claimed it would be an easy score, a way for the gang to make up some of their losses. Dutch, eager to believe good news and to prove he was still in control, began planning a robbery of the riverboat, without considering that Bronte might be setting them up. Meanwhile, the gang tried to establish themselves in Saint-Denis. Arthur began networking with various criminals and contacts in the city, learning about potential opportunities. He met with street kids who worked as pickpockets and informants, established relationships with fence operations where they could sell stolen goods, and scouted potential targets. During this time, Arthur's health began to deteriorate. He developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, dismissed it as nothing serious,
Perhaps just the coal smoke and polluted air of the city. But the cough grew worse, and Arthur began experiencing fatigue and shortness of breath. The tuberculosis he had contracted from Thomas Downs was beginning to take hold, though Arthur didn't yet realize the severity of his condition. The gang also became involved in various side ventures while in Saint Denis. They helped a suffragette movement, participated in illegal fighting rings, and even took on work for the city's elite when it suited their purposes. But each interaction with civilized society only reinforced how out of place they were. The world had moved on, and the Vanderlyn gang were relics of a dying age. Hosea, sensing the end was near, began trying to set up an exit strategy independent of Dutch's increasingly erratic plans. He worked with Arthur and Lenny to plan a bank robbery in Saint Denis, one that could potentially give them enough money to disappear without needing the Blackwater money or Dutch's next big score. It would be risky, but Hosea believed it was their best chance at a clean break. Dutch insisted on following through on Bronte's tip about the riverboat. The job was planned as a sophisticated operation. Gang members would pose as passengers and workers, then take control of the boat once it was far enough from shore that escape would be difficult for their victims. It was the kind of elaborate, theatrical robbery that Dutch loved, full of drama and pageantry. The riverboat job initially went smoothly. The gang members infiltrated the boat successfully, and when Dutch gave the signal, they took control with minimal bloodshed. They rounded up the wealthy passengers and began collecting their valuables. Dutch seemed in his element, playing the charming outlaw, making speeches about the hypocrisy of the rich while robbing them blind. But then the boat reached the dock in Saint Denis and everything went wrong. The Pinkertons were waiting, along with what seemed like half the police force in the city. Bronte had set them up, feeding information to the law in exchange for having the gang eliminated. The riverboat became a death trap, with gang members pinned down by gunfire from all sides. In the chaos, the gang fought their way off the boat and into the streets of Saint Denis. A massive gunfight erupted in the middle of the city, with civilians running for cover as outlaws and lawmen exchanged fire. The gang was scattered, each member fighting for their lives, trying to reach some kind of safety. Lenny Summers, the intelligent and promising young man who had shown such potential, was shot and killed during the escape. He died on a Saint Denis street, another casualty of Dutch's failing leadership. The gang barely made it back to camp, traumatized and furious about the ambush. Dutch's response to the betrayal was immediate and violent. He decided they would kill Angelo Bronte, not for money or strategic advantage, but purely for revenge. Arthur and others tried to argue against it, pointing out that killing Bronte would bring even more heat down on them, but Dutch wouldn't listen. He was past the point of strategic thinking, operating on pure emotion and ego. The gang raided Bronte's mansion, fighting through his guards and security. They captured Bronte, and Dutch, in a moment of cold brutality, strangled him and fed his body to an alligator in the swamps outside Saint Denis. It was an act of savage violence that went beyond anything the gang had done before, crossing yet another line in Dutch's descent into madness. With Bronte dead and the Pinkertons closing in, Hosea pushed for the bank robbery as their last chance. Dutch agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to finally get enough money to escape. The plan was to rob the Saint Denis Bank in daylight, a bold move that required precise timing and coordination. The gang members involved in the robbery included Dutch, Arthur, Hosea, John, Charles, Bill, Javier, Lenny, and Micah. They entered the bank posing as customers, then revealed themselves when the moment was right. The initial robbery went smoothly. They secured the bank employees and customers, cracked the vault, and began loading money into their bags. But the Pinkertons had been watching the gang, waiting for them to make a move. Agent Milton had anticipated they would try something desperate, and the bank was the most obvious target. As the gang prepared to leave, they found the building surrounded by Pinkertons and police. It was another trap, but this time not from a criminal rival, but from the law itself.
What followed was one of the bloodiest shootouts in Saint Denis history. The gang fought from inside the bank, trying to find a way out, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Hosea, attempting to negotiate a way out, was shot in the chest by Agent Milton in cold blood. The old con man, Dutch's oldest friend and most trusted advisor, died on the bank steps. In the chaos, Abigail was captured by the Pinkertons. John, seeing his wife taken, nearly got himself killed trying to reach her. Arthur managed to pull him back, and the surviving gang members fought their way through the streets, leaving a trail of bodies behind them. They made it to the docks, where they commandeered a ship, planning to escape by sea. But a massive storm was rolling in, and as they sailed out of the harbor, they found themselves caught in a hurricane. The ship was battered by waves, and despite their best efforts to keep it afloat, it ultimately broke apart, sending the gang members into the churning ocean. Arthur woke up on a beach, battered and half drowned. Around him, he found Dutch, Micah, Bill, and Javier, the only other gang members who had washed ashore. They had no idea where they were, no supplies, and no way to contact anyone. As they explored their surroundings, they realized they were on an island called Guarma, somewhere in the Caribbean, far from home. Guarma was a beautiful place turned into hell by human greed. The island was controlled by Alberto Fusar, a dictator who ran sugar plantations using slave labor and brutal oppression. Fusar was backed by the Lemoyne Raiders and maintained his power through violence and fear. The local population was crushed under his regime, living in poverty while Fusar enriched himself. The gang quickly found themselves caught up in the island's revolutionary movement. They encountered Hercule Fontaine, a rebel leader fighting against Fusar's regime. With no other options and needing to find a way off the island, Dutch made a deal with Hercule. The gang would help the rebels overthrow Fusar in exchange for passage back to America. Dutch threw himself into the revolution with an enthusiasm that bordered on mania. Here was a cause that aligned perfectly with his philosophy: fighting against tyranny, liberating the oppressed, and striking back against corrupt power. For a brief moment, Dutch seemed like his old self, the charismatic revolutionary who believed in fighting for justice. The gang participated in multiple attacks against Fusar's forces. They raided plantations, freed slaves, destroyed supply lines, and sabotaged military installations. Arthur, despite his declining health, fought alongside them, though he was beginning to notice troubling signs in Dutch's behavior. Dutch was taking unnecessary risks, making impulsive decisions, and showing less concern for the lives of those around him. During one assault on a Fusar compound, Dutch executed an old woman in cold blood simply because she insulted him. It was a senseless act of violence that served no strategic purpose, and Arthur was horrified. When he confronted Dutch about it, Dutch offered weak justifications about the chaos of war and the necessity of sending a message. The rebellion culminated in an assault on Fusar's compound. The gang, along with Hercule and his rebels, fought their way through Fusar's guards. In the final confrontation, Dutch personally killed Fusar, shooting him in the head and watching him tumble from the tower where he had ruled his little empire.
With Fusar dead, the rebels controlled the island, and Hercule arranged for a ship to take the gang back to America. But the experience on Guarma had changed something in Dutch. He had gotten a taste of being not just an outlaw leader, but a revolutionary general, someone who led armies and toppled governments. The return to being a hunted criminal seemed like a step down from the grandiose role he had played on the island. The ship took them back to Lemoyne, and the gang members made their way back to Shady Belle, hoping to reunite with the rest of the gang. But when they arrived, they found the camp abandoned. After the disaster in Saint Denis, the remaining gang members had fled north, establishing a new camp in the mountains near Ansburg, a mining town in New Hanover. The gang's new camp at Beaver Hollow was a dark, depressing place, hidden in a cave system that had once been used by a murderous family called the Murphree Brood. The gang had cleared out the Murphrees, but the location still felt cursed, tainted by the violence that had occurred there. It was fitting, in a way, that their final camp would be in such a grim location. Arthur arrived to find the gang in disarray. Morale was at an all-time low. Hosea was dead. Lenny was dead. Sean was dead. And Abigail was in custody. The gang had lost many of its best people, and those who remained were questioning everything. Sadie Adler had stepped up as one of the gang's most capable fighters, proving herself in Arthur's absence. Charles Smith, the quiet and competent tracker, had kept things together as best he could, but without Dutch's leadership, the gang had been adrift. Dutch's return should have stabilized things, but instead it made them worse. He was more paranoid than ever, constantly talking about loyalty and faith, questioning anyone who expressed doubts about his plans. He had become close with Micah Bell, relying on him more than anyone else, listening to his poisonous advice while pushing away those who had been with him for decades. Arthur's health continued to deteriorate. His cough was constant now, and he was losing weight. During a routine loan collection for Strauss, Arthur collapsed, coughing up blood. He was taken to a doctor in Saint Denis,
who delivered devastating news. Arthur had tuberculosis, a disease that was essentially a death sentence in 1899. The doctor gave him weeks, maybe months if he was lucky, and told him to rest and avoid stress. But rest wasn't an option. The gang needed him, and Arthur couldn't abandon them even knowing he was dying. The diagnosis changed something fundamental in Arthur, though. Faced with his own mortality, he began to question everything he had devoted his life to. Had it all been worth it? Had Dutch's vision ever been real, or had it always been a fantasy used to justify a life of crime? Arthur began keeping a journal during this period, documenting his thoughts and experiences. He wrote about his regrets, his lost love Mary, his dead son Isaac, and his growing doubts about Dutch. The journal entries revealed a man struggling to find meaning in a life that had been defined by violence and loyalty to a cause that might have been hollow all along. Sister Calderon, a nun he encountered during one of his trips to Saint Denis, became an unlikely source of guidance for Arthur. She saw past his tough exterior to the man struggling with his conscience. She asked him simple but profound questions. What did he believe in? What would he die for? How would he be remembered? These conversations pushed Arthur toward a realization. He couldn't save Dutch, couldn't save the gang, but maybe he could save some of the people in it. He began working to help John, Abigail, and Jack escape, to give them a chance at a better life. He also started trying to help other gang members, particularly the women and those who wanted out. Dutch, meanwhile, became focused on one more big score. He had been contacted by Eagle Flies, the son of Rain's Fall, the chief of the Wapiti Native American tribe. The Wapiti were being pushed off their land by the U.S. Army, led by Colonel Favors. Eagle Flies wanted to fight back, to attack the army and reclaim what had been stolen from his people. Rain's Fall, a peaceful man who had watched his people suffer and die for years, begged Eagle Flies not to go to war. He knew the army was too powerful, that any attack would result in the annihilation of their tribe. But Eagle Flies was young and angry, unwilling to accept defeat without fighting back. Dutch saw an opportunity. He befriended Eagle Flies, encouraging his desire for revenge, promising to help him fight the army. But Dutch's real interest was in a train carrying army payroll, money that could fund the gang's escape. He was using Eagle Flies and his people's suffering as a means to an end, and Arthur saw through it immediately. Arthur tried to reason with Dutch, pointing out that they were leading the Wapiti to slaughter, that they had no business getting involved in their fight. But Dutch accused Arthur of having lost faith, of being weak and disloyal. The confrontation revealed how far Dutch had fallen. The man who once claimed to fight for the oppressed was now exploiting them for personal gain. The situation came to a head when Eagle Flies launched an attack on an oil refinery owned by Leviticus Cornwall. Cornwall himself appeared during the chaos. In a moment of sudden violence, Dutch shot Cornwall dead, killing one of the most powerful men in America. It was a point of no return. Killing Cornwall would bring the full weight of the government and the Pinkertons down on them. Arthur was furious.
Killing Cornwall served no purpose except satisfying Dutch's ego. It wasn't about money or survival anymore. It was about Dutch proving he was still relevant, still dangerous, still capable of making grand gestures. But grand gestures wouldn't save them. They would only speed their destruction. The gang became aware that they had a traitor in their midst. Money and information were disappearing, and someone was clearly feeding details to the Pinkertons. Dutch became obsessed with finding the rat, convinced that rooting out the betrayer would solve all their problems. Micah fed this paranoia, suggesting that Arthur and John were the most likely suspects, pointing to Arthur's recent questioning of Dutch's leadership as evidence of betrayal. Arthur knew the real rat was likely Micah himself, but he had no proof, and Dutch wouldn't listen to accusations against his new favorite. The gang was tearing itself apart from within, with loyalties divided and trust shattered. Some members sided with Dutch and Micah, believing that loyalty meant following orders without question. Others sided with Arthur and John, seeing that Dutch had led them into disaster after disaster. The plan to rob the army payroll train went forward despite all objections. Dutch, Arthur, John, and several others joined Eagle Flies and his warriors in attacking the train. The robbery was successful, but it came at a terrible cost. Eagle Flies was mortally wounded during the escape, dying shortly after in front of his heartbroken father.
Rainsfall confronted Dutch, asking him if his gold was worth his son's life. Dutch had no answer, no justification that could satisfy a father's grief. The old chief left with his son's body, and the tribe, decimated and broken, prepared to flee their homeland forever. Dutch had helped destroy an entire people for a bag of money. Arthur's condition continued to worsen. He was now frequently coughing up blood, struggling to breathe, and could barely keep food down. He was dying, and everyone could see it. But he kept pushing forward, driven by a desperate need to do something right before the end. Abigail was eventually rescued from the Pinkertons, but not through Dutch's efforts. Sadie and Arthur took matters into their own hands, staging a daring rescue that succeeded despite Dutch's lack of interest in helping. This was another sign of how far Dutch had fallen. He once would have moved heaven and earth to save a member of the family. Now he couldn't be bothered to lift a finger. The tension in camp reached a breaking point when Agent Milton appeared, having captured John and brought him to Beaver Hollow. But Milton's real purpose was to deliver a message. He revealed the truth about the traitor. It wasn't Arthur or John or anyone Dutch suspected. It was Molly O'Shea, Dutch's former lover, who had been feeding information to the Pinkertons out of jealousy and spite after Dutch cast her aside. But before anyone could process this revelation, Susan Grimshaw shot Molly dead, executing her for betrayal. It was a moment of shocking violence that revealed how paranoid and fractured the gang had become. They were killing each other now, executing their own family members based on accusations. But Milton had more to say. He revealed that while Molly had talked to them, She hadn't actually given them any useful information. She had been too drunk and incoherent to betray anything important. The Pinkertons had been finding the gang through their own detective work and through the actions of the real traitor, someone they had cultivated within the gang. Before Milton could reveal who the real rat was, Abigail appeared and shot him dead. The gang would remain in the dark about the traitor's identity for a little while longer, but Arthur had his suspicions, and they all centered on Micah Bell. Dutch announced his final plan. They would rob a train carrying army payroll, one last score that would give them enough money to disappear forever. It was the same promise he had been making for months, the same fantasy that had led them from disaster to disaster. But this time, Dutch insisted, would be different. Arthur confronted Dutch one last time, begging him to see reason, to let people go if they wanted to leave, to stop the madness before more people died. Dutch's response was cold and dismissive. He accused Arthur of betrayal, of giving up, of being weak. When Arthur mentioned that he was dying, Dutch showed no sympathy, no regret, no acknowledgement of all the years Arthur had devoted to him. The train robbery was a disaster from the start. The Pinkertons were waiting, having been tipped off about the gang's plans. The resulting gunfight was brutal, with gang members fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. During the chaos, Dutch ordered the gang to blow a bridge to slow the Pinkertons' pursuit, but the explosion was larger than expected, creating havoc.
In the aftermath, John Marston was shot and left for dead. Dutch, seeing John fall, didn't stop to help him. He kept running, focused only on escape. Arthur, despite his failing health, managed to get John to safety, hiding him in a cave and tending to his wounds. It was clear that Dutch had abandoned both of them, had written them off as acceptable losses. When Arthur returned to camp, he found Pinkertons attacking Beaver Hollow in force. Agent Ross, Milton's partner, was leading the assault, determined to wipe out the Vanderlinde gang once and for all. The gang fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In the chaos, Arthur finally confronted Micah, and Micah admitted the truth. He had been the rat all along, feeding information to the Pinkertons since they returned from Guarma. Dutch overheard this confession, and Arthur expected him to kill Micah on the spot. But Dutch did nothing. He stood frozen, unable or unwilling to accept that his most loyal follower had been betraying him all along. It was the final proof that Dutch had lost his mind, that the man Arthur had followed for decades was truly gone. The camp descended into chaos. Some gang members fled, others were killed by Pinkertons, and the family that had stayed together for so long finally shattered into pieces.
Sadie and Charles helped create a distraction, allowing others to escape. Tilly, Mary Beth, and the other women fled into the night, determined to start new lives away from the outlaw world. Pearson, Uncle, and Reverend Swanson had already left weeks earlier, seeing the writing on the wall. Arthur, knowing he only had hours left to live, made a choice. He helped John escape, giving him money and telling him to run to Abigail and Jack, to take them far away and never look back. John was reluctant to leave Arthur behind, but Arthur insisted. One of them had to survive, had to break the cycle and live a better life. It might as well be John. But Micah and Dutch weren't going to let them go that easily. They pursued Arthur and John, determined to tie up loose ends. A final confrontation was inevitable, and Arthur, despite his deteriorating condition, stood ready to face it. Arthur and John raced on horseback toward the Marston family, with Micah, Dutch, Bill, Javier, and several other gang members in pursuit. The chase was desperate, with Arthur coughing up blood and barely able to stay in the saddle. But he pushed forward, driven by his determination to give John a chance at redemption. They reached a fork in the path where a decision had to be made. Arthur told John to go to his family while he held off their pursuers. John refused to leave him, but Arthur insisted, telling John he had to think about Abigail and Jack now. After a moment of painful understanding, John finally agreed, clasping Arthur's hand one last time before riding off into the darkness. Arthur turned to face Dutch, Micah, and the others. He was alone now, dying, with nothing left to lose. Micah, sensing victory, taunted Arthur, calling him weak and pathetic. Dutch said nothing, just watched with an expression that might have been regret or might have been indifference. The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of the betrayals and lies that had destroyed the gang. Micah admitted again to being the Pinkerton informant, justifying it as survival, as doing what was necessary. Arthur called Dutch out for his failures, for his pride, for leading them all to destruction. Dutch's only response was to ask if Arthur was the one who had betrayed him, showing how completely he had lost touch with reality.
What happened next depended on the choices Arthur had made throughout his journey. If he had lived with honor, trying to help people and do good despite his criminal life, he faced Micah in a final confrontation with dignity. If he had lived dishonorably, pursuing money and violence above all else, his end was more brutal and hopeless. In the honorable version of events, Arthur and Micah fought on the clifftop as the sun rose over the mountains. Arthur, weakened by disease, was no match for the healthier, more brutal Micah. He was beaten down, bloodied, and barely conscious when Dutch finally arrived at the scene. Arthur, lying on the ground, looked up at Dutch one last time. In his final moments, he tried to reach the man he had known, the man who had saved him as a child. He reminded Dutch of who they used to be, of the principles they claimed to stand for. He told Dutch that Micah was the rat, that everything had fallen apart because Dutch had chosen to follow a snake instead of his family. Dutch stood between Arthur and Micah, faced with a choice. He could shoot Micah and acknowledge his terrible mistakes, or he could walk away and let Micah finish what he started. For a long moment, Dutch just stood there, his gun pointed at nothing, his expression unreadable. In the end, Dutch did nothing. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Arthur to die on the mountainside as the sun rose over the valley below. Micah, denied his moment of victory by Dutch's departure, looked at Arthur with frustration before also leaving, unwilling to waste ammunition on a man already dying. Arthur crawled to the edge of the cliff, looking out over the mountains as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. His last thoughts, recorded in his journal and reflected in his final expression, were about redemption. He had spent so many years killing, stealing, and living by the gun. But in his final months, he had tried to do good, tried to save people, tried to give John and his family a chance at something better. As his vision faded and his breathing stopped, Arthur Morgan died at peace, believing that perhaps his life had meant something after all. The sun rose fully over the mountains, illuminating the body of a man who had tried, in the end, to be better than his worst deeds. In the dishonorable version of events, Arthur's death was more tragic. He never made it to the clifftop. Instead, Micah shot him in the face during their confrontation, killing him brutally and without ceremony. There was no peaceful moment of reflection, no beautiful sunrise, just a violent end for a violent life. Dutch watched this happen and still walked away, abandoning Arthur in his final moment. Several years passed after Arthur's death. The Vanderlinde gang had scattered to the winds, with survivors trying to build new lives away from the outlaw world. John Marston took Arthur's advice to heart. He tried to go straight, to be a better man, to build a life for Abigail and Jack that didn't involve crime. He worked as a ranch hand under an assumed name, Jim Milton, alongside a fellow worker named Jake Adler, who was actually Sadie Adler in disguise. They both were trying to leave their past violence behind, to find some measure of peace in honest work. But the past has a way of catching up, and John found himself drawn back into violence when the ranch was threatened by local criminals.
John's skills as a gunfighter, developed over years with the gang, made him valuable, but also exposed him to danger. Abigail disapproved of any return to violence, fearing it would lead them back down the same path that had destroyed the gang. But John insisted he was just protecting what was theirs, that he was being a provider and protector, not an outlaw. Sadie Adler, meanwhile, had become a bounty hunter, channeling her rage and skills into hunting criminals for money. She was good at it, feared throughout the region as someone who always brought her targets in, dead or alive. She convinced John to help her with some bounties, promising good money and assuring him it was legal work. John reluctantly agreed, and they embarked on several bounty hunting missions together. During these adventures, John began to hear rumors about Micah Bell. The rat who had destroyed the gang was apparently living large somewhere, having built his own gang and taken over a mountain hideout. Even more disturbing were rumors that Micah had money, a lot of money, possibly from the Blackwater job that had started all their troubles. Jean tried to ignore these rumors, tried to focus on building his life with Abigail and Jack. He purchased land near Blackwater, in a beautiful area called Beecher's Hope, planning to build a ranch where his family could finally have a real home. With the help of Uncle, Charles Smith, and even Sadie, John began constructing buildings and establishing his homestead. But John couldn't let go of what Micah had done. Micah had betrayed Arthur, had destroyed the gang, and was now living free and prosperous while Arthur lay dead on a mountainside. The injustice of it ate at John, interfering with his sleep, poisoning his attempts at domestic happiness. Sadie, who had her own score to settle for Micah's role in the gang's destruction, proposed they hunt him down. She framed it as bringing a criminal to justice, but both knew it was about revenge. Charles, who had returned after starting a new life with a Native American tribe, agreed to help, feeling he owed it to Arthur's memory. The three of them tracked Micah to his camp on Mount Hagen, high in the mountains of Amberino. It was a treacherous journey through snow and ice, reminiscent of the gang's desperate flight after Blackwater years earlier. When they finally reached Micah's camp, they found it well defended, with Micah having recruited a small army of outlaws. A massive gunfight erupted, with John, Sadie, and Charles battling through Micah's gang. They fought their way up the mountain, leaving bodies in the snow, driven by a mixture of justice and vengeance. Finally, they confronted Micah himself in his cabin. Micah was defiant, taunting John about Arthur's death, about the gang's destruction, about how he had won and they had lost. The confrontation seemed destined to end in violence when suddenly Dutch appeared. He had been living in Micah's camp, apparently having partnered with the rat who destroyed his family. Dutch's presence complicated everything. He had once been like a father to John, had saved him as a child, had given him purpose and family. But Dutch had also abandoned John and Arthur when they needed him most, had chosen Micah over his own sons. John didn't know if Dutch was there to help Micah or to face his past.
The standoff was tense, with guns drawn and old wounds reopened. Micah continued to taunt, while Dutch remained silent, his expression unreadable. John finally told Dutch that Arthur had died trying to save him, had used his last breaths trying to remind Dutch of who he used to be. Something in Dutch broke at those words. He finally saw Micah for what he truly was, recognized his own failures and the terrible mistakes he had made. In a sudden movement, Dutch drew his gun and shot Micah Bell dead, killing the rat who had poisoned the gang and manipulated him for so long. Dutch looked at Micah's body, then at John. There was a moment of recognition, of regret, of acknowledgement for everything that had happened. Dutch told John simply, "I ain't got much to say no more," before walking away into the snow. He left behind a chest containing the money from Blackwater, the fortune that had started all their troubles. Dutch was finally letting go, finally accepting that his dreams were dead and his family was gone. John never saw Dutch again. He heard years later that Dutch had died, supposedly by suicide, having finally faced the reality of what he had become and what he had destroyed. The great philosopher-outlaw who had promised freedom and justice had ended his life alone and broken, unable to live with his failures. With the Blackwater money, John was able to complete his ranch and provide a real home for his family. He married Abigail officially, giving her and Jack the legitimate family they had always deserved. For a few years, they lived in peace at Beecher's Hope, with John working the land, Jack going to school, and Abigail finally able to rest after years of running from the law or losing John to violence. Uncle lived with them, still claiming his lumbago prevented him from doing much work, but providing companionship and bad jokes. Charles visited occasionally before eventually moving to Canada to start fresh. Sadie continued her bounty hunting, eventually heading to South America in pursuit of new challenges. Tilly married a lawyer and lived respectably. Mary Beth became a novelist, writing romanticized stories about the Old West. Pearson owned a general store in Rhodes. Reverend Swanson became a proper preacher again, finding sobriety and redemption in New York. Some gang members fared less well. Swanson ended up in prison. Bill Williamson formed his own gang in New Mexico, though it was a pale shadow of what the Vanderland gang had been. Javier Escuela fled to Mexico, resuming his revolutionary activities. Strauss was arrested and beaten to death by Pinkertons, but he never gave up the gang, showing loyalty to the end, despite his distasteful profession. For a time, it seemed John Marston had achieved what Arthur had wanted for him: redemption, a peaceful life, a chance to be better than his past. Jack was growing into a fine young man, educated and articulate, with opportunities his father never had. Abigail was happy, finally able to live without fear of running from the law or losing John to violence.
In 1911, 12 years after the gang's destruction, federal agents came to Beecher's Hope. They took Abigail and John hostage, forcing John into an impossible choice. Agent Ross, now a senior government official, offered John a deal: hunt down and kill or capture the surviving members of the Vanderlind gang, or his family would suffer the consequences. Ross specifically wanted Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela, both of whom had continued their criminal careers in the years since the gang's collapse. John had no choice but to agree. He was given government resources and sent to New Austin, where Bill had established his gang at Fort Mercer, an old military installation. John's first attempt to confront Bill alone was a disaster. He rode up to Fort Mercer and called Bill out, trying to convince his former brother to surrender peacefully. But Bill had become paranoid and cruel in the years since the gang's end, and he saw John as a traitor working for the government. Bill's men shot John and left him for dead outside the fort. John was saved by a local rancher named Bonnie McFarlane, who nursed him back to health at her family's ranch. As John recovered,
he began to understand that the world had changed even more than he realized. The frontier was truly dying now. Automobiles were becoming common, towns were growing into cities, and the old ways of life were being replaced by modernity. While working to repay the McFarlands for their kindness, John began assembling allies for his assault on Fort Mercer. He met Marshal Lee Johnson, a lawman who wanted to clean up New Austin, but lacked the manpower to take on Bill's gang directly. He encountered snake oil merchants, treasure hunters, and various other characters who painted a picture of the West in its final days. John also crossed paths with a man named Landon Ricketts, a legendary gunslinger from the previous generation who had survived the bloodiest days of the Old West and was now living out his retirement in Mexico. Ricketts saw something of his younger self in John and agreed to help him develop his skills and plan his assault on Fort Mercer. But before John could attack Bill, he learned that Williamson had fled across the border into Mexico, seeking protection from a powerful military leader named Colonel Allende. John had no choice but to follow, crossing into Mexico and entering a country in the midst of revolutionary chaos. Mexico in 1911 was torn between government forces loyal to Allende and rebels fighting for freedom under Abraham Reyes. John found himself caught between these factions, forced to work for both sides while trying to locate Bill and Javier. He worked for Allende initially, performing various tasks and missions, all while being assured that the colonel would hand over Bill and Javier when the time was right. But John quickly realized that Allende was a monster, a corrupt military dictator who oppressed the people and ruled through fear and violence. Allende had no intention of honoring his promises to John. He was merely using him as a tool while harboring Bill and Javier for his own purposes.
The revolution came to a head at Allende's villa, where John, Reyes, and the rebels launched a massive assault. In the chaos of battle, John finally caught up with Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela. Javier, who had once been John's friend and brother, couldn't bring himself to fight seriously against John. When cornered, he seemed almost relieved that his years of running were over. John either captured him alive or killed him, depending on his choices. Bill Williamson, however, was killed during the assault. As the villa burned and government forces collapsed, Bill tried to flee and was shot down. He died in Mexico, far from home, a bitter and paranoid man whose attempt to recreate Dutch's gang had led only to his own destruction. With Bill and Javier dealt with, John prepared to return home, believing his obligation to the government was fulfilled. But Agent Ross had one more name on his list, one more gang member who needed to be brought to justice: Dutch van der Linde. Dutch had been living in the mountains of tall trees with a small group of Native Americans who had rejected the reservation system and chose to live free in the old ways. Dutch had found a new family, a new gang of sorts,
but he was a shadow of the charismatic leader he had once been. He was older, more tired, and seemed to know his time was running out. John tracked Dutch to his camp at Cochinai, high in the mountains. The journey required fighting through Dutch's gang, young Native Americans who believed in Dutch's message of resistance against civilization. When John finally confronted Dutch, the old outlaw wasn't surprised to see him. Dutch didn't beg for mercy or try to justify his actions. He simply talked with John, discussing the old days, the gang, and how everything had fallen apart. Dutch mentioned Arthur, acknowledging in his own way the mistakes he had made. Dutch told John that he had tried, that he had really tried to do something meaningful, to fight against the corruption and greed of civilization. But in the end, he had become just another killer, just another man who destroyed everything he touched. With federal agents and soldiers closing in, Dutch stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the valley below. He told John that the government would never let him be free, that they would always find a reason to use him for one more job. He said simply, "Our time has passed, John," before stepping backward off the cliff, choosing to end his life on his own terms rather than being captured and paraded as a trophy. John watched Dutch fall, marking the end of the man who had shaped so much of his life. With Dutch's death, all the major members of the Vanderlinde gang's leadership were gone. Hosea, Arthur, Micah, Bill, Javier, and now Dutch. The family that had once seemed unbreakable was completely destroyed. Agent Ross, true to his word, released John's family and allowed him to return to Beecher's Hope. For a brief time, John lived the life he had dreamed of. He worked the ranch with Jack, teaching his son how to be a man. He reconnected with Abigail, trying to make up for all the years of pain and fear he had put her through. Uncle was there, still lazy, but providing companionship. John taught Jack to hunt, to ride, to shoot, and to work the land. But he also encouraged Jack's education, wanting his son to have opportunities beyond the ranch. Abigail was proud of Jack's intelligence and his love of reading, seeing in him the chance for the Marston family to finally become respectable. But John's past came calling one final time. Agent Ross, despite his promises, had decided that John Marston knew too much and had too many skills to be left alive. The government couldn't risk him returning to crime or teaching others his ways. Ross assembled a massive force of soldiers and bureau agents, and in 1914 they descended on Beecher's Hope. John, Abigail, Jack, and Uncle found themselves surrounded by an army. Uncle, despite his complaints about lumbago, took up a rifle to help defend the ranch and was gunned down almost immediately. John got Abigail and Jack to safety, telling them to run while he held off the attackers. What followed was John's last stand, a final act of sacrifice that defined his redemption. John burst out of the barn, facing an army of armed men alone. He managed to take down several of them with his legendary quick-draw skills, but the outcome was inevitable. John Marston was shot multiple times and fell dead in front of his barn, his blood staining the dirt of the ranch he had built as his redemption. Abigail and Jack returned after the soldiers left to find John's body. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple marker bearing his name. Abigail died 3 years later, in 1917, some said of heartbreak, leaving Jack an orphan at 19 years old. Jack Marston, the boy who had been raised in the gang's camps, who had been kidnapped by the Braithwaites, who had witnessed so much violence and loss, now faced a choice. He could honor his father's sacrifice by living peacefully, becoming the educated, respectable man his parents had wanted him to be, or he could seek revenge for his father's murder. In 1914, Jack tracked down Edgar Ross, who had retired from the Bureau and was living comfortably off his government pension. Ross was duck hunting with his brother on the San Luis River when Jack confronted him. The former agent recognized Jack and seemed unsurprised that John's son had come for him. The confrontation was tense. Ross showed no remorse for John's death, claiming he was simply doing his job, cleaning up the remnants of a criminal gang that had terrorized the country for years. Jack, his voice cold and determined, told Ross that John Marston had been his father, a man who had tried to live honestly and had been murdered for it. What happened next is left somewhat ambiguous, but gunshots rang out across the river. When the smoke cleared, Edgar Ross lay dead, and Jack Marston walked away, having avenged his father, but also having taken his first steps down the same violent path that had destroyed the Vanderlinde gang. The cycle of violence that had begun with Dutch's philosophy, that had consumed Arthur, John, and so many others, now threatened to consume Jack as well. The boy who should have been the one to break free, to live the peaceful life his father and Arthur had died to give him, had instead chosen revenge over redemption. And so the story of the Vanderlinde gang truly ended, not with Dutch's death or John's sacrifice, but with Jack Marston, the last remnant of that doomed family, walking into an uncertain future, having learned all the wrong lessons from the men who raised him.
But John's past came calling one final time. Agent Ross, despite his promises, had decided that John Marston knew too much and had too many skills to be left alive. The government couldn't risk him returning to crime or teaching others his ways. Ross assembled a massive force of soldiers and bureau agents, and in 1914 they descended on Beecher's Hope. John, Abigail, Jack, and Uncle found themselves surrounded by an army. Uncle, despite his complaints about lumbago, took up a rifle to help defend the ranch and was gunned down almost immediately. John got Abigail and Jack to safety, telling them to run while he held off the attackers. What followed was John's last stand, a
final act of sacrifice that defined his redemption. John burst out of the barn, facing an army of armed men alone. He managed to take down several of them with his legendary quick-draw skills, but the outcome was inevitable. John Marston was shot multiple times and fell dead in front of his barn, his blood staining the dirt of the ranch he had built as his redemption. Abigail and Jack returned after the soldiers left to find John's body. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple marker bearing his name. Abigail died 3 years later, in 1917, some said of heartbreak, leaving Jack an orphan at 19 years old. Jack Marston, the boy who had been raised in the gang's camps, who had been kidnapped by the Braithwaites, who had witnessed so much violence and loss, now faced a choice. He could honor his father's sacrifice by living peacefully, becoming the educated, respectable man his parents had wanted him to be, or he could seek revenge for his father's murder. In 1914, Jack tracked down Edgar Ross, who had retired from the Bureau and was living comfortably off his government pension. Ross was duck hunting with his brother on the San Luis River when Jack confronted him. The former agent recognized Jack and seemed unsurprised that John's son had come for him. The confrontation was tense. Ross showed no remorse for John's death, claiming he was simply doing his job, cleaning up the remnants of a criminal gang that had terrorized the country for years. Jack, his voice cold and determined, told Ross that John Marston had been his father, a man who had tried to live honestly and had been murdered for it. What happened next is left somewhat ambiguous, but gunshots rang out across the river. When the smoke cleared, Edgar Ross lay dead, and Jack Marston walked away, having avenged his father, but also having taken his first steps down the same violent path that had destroyed the Vanderlyn gang. The cycle of violence that had begun with Dutch's philosophy, that had consumed Arthur, John, and so many others, now threatened to consume Jack as well. The boy who should have been the one to break free, to live the peaceful life his father and Arthur had died to give him, had instead chosen revenge over redemption. And so, the story of the Vanderlyn gang truly ended, not with Dutch's death or John's sacrifice, but with Jack Marston, the last remnant of that doomed family, walking into an uncertain future, having learned all the wrong lessons from the men who raised them. The story of the Vanderlyn gang is ultimately a tragedy about loyalty, betrayal, and the death of an ideal. Dutch Vanderlyn began with genuine beliefs about freedom and justice, but his philosophy was always built on a foundation of contradictions. He claimed to fight for the oppressed while robbing and killing. He preached about family and loyalty while manipulating people to serve his own vision. He spoke of freedom while demanding absolute obedience. Arthur Morgan's journey represents the possibility of redemption even in the final moments of a wasted life. He spent decades as a killer and criminal, believing he was serving a righteous cause, only to realize in his final months that it had all been a lie. But rather than giving in to despair, Arthur used his remaining time to try to do good, to save those he could, to give meaning to his death, if not his life. John Marston's story is about the impossibility of escaping your past. No matter how hard he tried to go straight, to be a good father and husband, the life he had lived came back to claim him. The government that forced him to hunt his former brothers was the same civilized authority that Dutch had always warned about, proving in its own way that Dutch's paranoia about institutional power wasn't entirely unfounded. The game explores the death of the Old West and the closing of the frontier. Throughout the story, characters constantly discuss how the world is changing, how there's no place left for outlaws and gunslingers, how civilization is spreading and taming the wild spaces. The Van der Linde gang's destruction is part of this larger process, the elimination of the last remnants of lawless freedom in favor of ordered society. But the game also questions whether this progress is truly positive. The civilized world that replaces the frontier is full of its own corruption, exploitation, and cruelty. The banks the Dutch robbed really did foreclose on families and destroy lives. The railroad barons really did exploit workers and steal land. The government really did betray John after he served them faithfully. In many ways, the evils of civilization that Dutch railed against were real, even if his methods of fighting them were ultimately destructive.